In May of 1998, detectives in Shasta County, California were in the middle of questioning a man in connection with a very disturbing and very heartbreaking local murder. This man was their prime suspect, and based on what police had already found, there was very little doubt that he was guilty. The whole thing seemed like an open and shut case, until investigators moved on to why the guy had actually done this. That's when he launched into this wild story about covert CIA operations, overseas militant groups, and a secret organization of hired assassins. Understandably, this all sounded crazy, but it turned out that there was actually a sort of hidden thread underneath all of this. And once detectives discovered what this was, everything would finally begin to fall into place. The spring of 1998 was an exciting time for husband and wife Todd and Carole Garton. The young couple were just weeks away from welcoming their first child into the world, and they were busy with all of the preparations to make sure that they were ready for their roles as new parents. Todd and Carole had both grown up around Portland, Oregon, and had basically been together from the time they first met. They were high school sweethearts, quickly bonding over their shared love of music. At the time, Todd was in a band, and Carole wrote and played her own material as a singer-songwriter. They would help each other work on their songs, and Carole especially would come out and watch Todd perform at local indie music venues. Initially, Todd had hopes of becoming a rock star. However, as is the story with many people, these dreams eventually fizzled out. That's when he and Carole decided to settle down. They moved to California, and in 1991, they got married. Todd did a short stint in the Marines, though was eventually discharged due to health issues. Afterwards, he began working for his father's fencing company, and Carole began a career working in the insurance industry. The couple didn't make a whole lot of money, but it was enough for them to afford a modest little place in the community of Cottonwood. They still needed to have a roommate, but, they were getting by. And once they were settled there, their next priority became starting a family. Sadly, the couple struggled to conceive for quite a few years. This really affected Carole in particular because she wanted more than anything to be a mom. In the fall of 1997, though, it seemed like her dreams had finally come true. She got pregnant, and she and Todd found out that they were going to have a little boy. They decided they would name him Jesse James. It's not clear if Todd and Carole chose the name as an homage to the American cowboy/outlaw, as Jesse was also Todd's middle name, though Todd and Carole were definitely gun people. Todd really enjoyed hunting, and he even had a side hustle selling camouflage and other accessories at local gun shows. By May of 1998, Todd and Carole were just a short time away from the birth. Carole was 8 months pregnant, and they were scrambling around making sure everything was ready for the arrival of their baby. They were fixing up their home, taking birthing classes, and, just overall making sure they felt prepared. The timing couldn't have been better as far as Carole was concerned. Not only was her son supposed to arrive on June 14th, which happened to be her birthday as well, but her friend Tracy was also pregnant, so they were sharing a lot of the experience together. On May 16th, so less than a month away from the due date, Carole and Tracy went out to tour the maternity ward of the hospital where they both planned to give birth. It was in the city of Redding, just a little ways north of Cottonwood, and the women spent the morning walking around and excitingly peeking in on the newborns there. Afterwards, they stopped off at the Anderson Gun Show, which was on their way. It was a Saturday, so Todd was there doing his usual thing selling camouflage equipment. Tracy's husband was also a vendor there, and a couple of Todd's friends were helping him out as well. Because everyone knew each other, they all spent a while hanging out. But eventually, Carole said she needed to get off her feet and was thinking about heading back home. She was pretty tired, so one of Todd's friends offered to drive, which she accepted. They left, and Todd and the others continued on with the rest of the show. By all indications, the whole thing was like any other weekend. But that would quickly change when Todd arrived home that evening. Within just a couple of minutes, Shasta County Police would receive a frantic 911 call.
911, what is your emergency?
We have a woman, and she's on the floor, bleeding. Maybe that somebody shot somebody here. I don't know what's going on. Her name is Carole.
The 911 call that you just heard was placed shortly before 7 p.m. on May 16, 1998. It was made by Todd and Carole's roommate, 28-year-old Dale Gordon, who stated that he and Todd had just made a horrifying discovery inside their residence. They had arrived home to find Carole lying in a pool of blood inside her bedroom. After rushing to the house, police and paramedics were met by Todd outside, who appeared to be in a state of total panic. He said that his wife was completely unresponsive. He had been trying to perform CPR, but said it didn't look like she was breathing. Upon making their way into Todd and Carole's bedroom, emergency responders were met with an awful scene. Reports contradict each other about the exact circumstances, with some stating that Carole was lying on the bed and others claiming she was on the floor. Regardless, the reality of what had happened was the same. Carole had been the victim of a savage attack. Paramedics tried their best to save her, but there was nothing they could do. Both she and her unborn child were dead. An autopsy would later fill in the remaining gut-wrenching details. Carole had been shot 5 times with a .44 caliber weapon. The bullets had hit her in the head, legs, and abdomen. It looked like she had been attacked while she was in bed and never even had the opportunity to defend herself. When detectives arrived and had a closer look at the crime scene, other unsettling things quickly stood out. There were no signs of a struggle in the home, and nothing was out of place. To them, it was an indication that whoever had done this had specifically come into the house to target Carole. Speaking of coming into the house, there were also no signs of forced entry. Either Carole had let her killer in, or the person had gotten in on their own. Either way, to investigators, it suggested that the culprit was probably familiar with the property. Going off this idea, detectives questioned Todd and Dale. They asked them for any information they had about what was going on and what Carole had been doing that day. Both Todd and Dale brought up the gun show and said that they had last seen Carole there earlier that afternoon. She had left with their mutual friend, Norman Daniels, who was supposed to be giving her a ride home. They also told police something else important. Carole's white Jeep was missing from the driveway. That was the vehicle that her and Norman had left the gun show in. At this point, detectives had to consider the possibility that there was a second victim. If Norman was with Carole, he very well could be in danger too, especially because Todd and Dale were insistent that Norman would never do anything to hurt Carole. These fears only grew when several hours later, Carole's white Jeep was found abandoned at a local park and ride a few miles south of Cottonwood. Understandably, things weren't looking good, but police were about to be dealt the first of what would become many strange twists in this case. It happened when a team of officers went to Norman's apartment to search for additional information about where he might be. As they were standing outside, a cab pulled up. Inside that cab was Norman Daniels. By the time Norman was found and was brought in for an interview, it was the next day, May 17th. And as you might imagine, the second he stepped out of that cab alive and completely unharmed, investigators had a lot of questions for him. First and foremost, what had happened after he left the gun show with Carole the previous afternoon? Norman said that, as far as he was aware, not much. He said he and Carole headed back to her house and had spent a while finishing a movie she and Todd had rented. He said she didn't finish the whole thing. She had been tired, so at some point she got up and went to have a nap in her bedroom. He said he stayed until the movie was over and then went and told Carole he was going to return it to the video store. He said this is why he had taken her Jeep. He also claimed this wasn't unusual. Todd and Carole often let him borrow the vehicle, and the group of them were pretty close. They all got along well because all of the guys were ex-military. Todd and Dale were in the Marines while he had served in the Army. He stated that when he left the house that afternoon, everything was fine.
She had handed the key to me, said, "I'm tired." And I just felt really like driving.
So you go from straight home?
Correct. She came in. I put the movie in.
Did you both watch it?
Oh, we started it together. Just about 20 minutes into it, she said, "Well, I'm really down. I feel a little tired." I said, "Okay, no problem." Finished the movie. I rewound the movie and was getting ready to take it back. I was contemplating on just going and not tell her I was bleeding. I decided against it. I went in there. I said, Carole. She said, huh? She woke up. I'm taking these back. And I laughed,
Detectives listened to all of this patiently, but they knew this couldn't be the whole story. A lot of it just felt off, and the part with the Jeep in particular made zero sense. Like, you went to return a movie and then you just left Carole's vehicle in a random parking lot miles away from her home? Why? Anyway, while this was happening, other members of the investigative team managed to obtain a search warrant for Norman's apartment. When they went inside, it became pretty obvious why he wasn't being very forthcoming. A number of very incriminating items had been left out in the open. Among them, blood-stained clothing, spent .44 caliber shell casings, and a .44 caliber Rossi revolver. All of the evidence matched Carole's autopsy and what had been found at the crime scene. This information was relayed to the detectives who were interviewing Norman, who confronted him with the new information. As soon as he heard that police had been inside his home, his composure completely shifted. He started shaking and sweating profusely and went as pale as a ghost. Moments later, he began delivering an absolutely chilling confession.
I can't save you now. Getting my nerve up to do this was I think that was the hardest. I'm thinking I've got to do it now or I'm never going to do it. I have a fifth blog.
Okay.
She's still laying down. She's asleep. I was leery about what I was doing because I've never done it before. I walk up to the side of the bed, pull the jacket away, grab the pistol, and as I turned, I immediately fired. Her eyes opened up for a second, and then she pulled her arms up over her face. She jerked up again and started to roll over onto her belly. The last shot, I moved to a position where I aimed. I didn't keep count, so I caught you all the time.
Did you cock it between each round? Why did you do that?
Make sure I don't.
As you just heard, Norman admitted to ambushing Carole after she had gone into her bedroom to take a nap. He said that after working up the nerve, he had shot her at close range again and again. Immediately, Carole had jolted awake, and as a last desperate survival instinct, she had tried to roll over to save her unborn son from this brutal attack. Heartbreakingly, though, Norman kept right on shooting. He said that afterwards, he rushed home, changed his clothes, and cleaned the murder weapon. He then went and dumped Carole's Jeep to make it look like she could have been the victim of a carjacking. Now, obviously, this was horrifying, but it kind of seemed like an open and shut case. As you may have noticed, though, there was something pretty crucial missing from all of this. A motive. Norman had just admitted to murdering the wife and unborn child of one of his close friends in cold blood. Surely there had to be a reason, at least in his mind, for all of this. Well, as I alluded to earlier, there was. Only it was an explanation police were completely unprepared for.
It was very hard when I did. People do stupid things. I did something very stupid. I'm a killer for hire. They're basically on the staff. IRA.
In case you're wondering if you heard that last clip right, yes, that's the IRA as in the Irish Republican Army. Now, I definitely don't have time to dig into decades, if not centuries, of British-Irish history here, but for those who have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, the IRA was a collection of militant and political organizations that fought the British rule over Northern Ireland. This went on for decades, with a particularly violent period occurring between the late 1960s and 1990s that is often referred to as the Troubles. Depending on who you ask, the conflict was about a lot of other things, including religion, but for our purposes, all you need to know is that a lot of really heinous stuff went on. Things like riots, bombings, and murders were common, and for a lot of people outside of the UK and Ireland, the IRA became synonymous with a lot of this. If you're a viewer from the UK or Ireland, I can already hear you typing in the comments section, and I want to say that I apologize and I love you. Just know that I know that this is a dramatic oversimplification, but again, I just had to offer some kind of quick explanation. Speaking of explanations, that's also what police wanted when Norman casually claimed to be an IRA assassin. You know, how did he get involved with an overseas militant group? And why did they want Carole Garton dead? Norman said that he didn't actually work for the IRA specifically. It was a little more complicated than that. He claimed he was part of a group simply known as the Company. According to Norman, the Company was a secret international network of hitmen, information brokers, and other shady characters. Most of the people who belonged to it were operatives from high-level government organizations such as the CIA, but he said that they would also recruit people like him who were ex-military. He said one of the main things they were involved in were assassinations, and that they would take contracts from all over the place. That's how he had come to be involved in the murder of Carole Garton. Norman explained that he was in contact with a man who he knew only as Colonel Sean. Colonel Sean was part of both the Company and the IRA, and he said he was the one who had given him his orders to carry out the hit. In terms of why Carole had been targeted, Norman said that he wasn't exactly sure. You know, this wasn't a situation where you asked a lot of questions, but he claimed he did have an idea. He was pretty sure it had something to do with Carole's involvement in the IRA. That's right, Norman claimed she was an assassin too. Norman said that most of his communications with Colonel Sean had happened over email, but on March 28th he received a mysterious envelope. That envelope was very official looking and had been secured with a wax seal. Inside were a bunch of instructions and information. There was also a photo that included Carole, Todd, and one other person. Todd and the other guy were X'd out, but Carole had been circled.
What was in the package?
It had 3 pictures of Carole. She was an IRA agent. One of the pictures included Todd and one other gentleman. Both Todd and the gentleman were X'd out. She was circled.
Okay.
On the back of that picture I just explained to you was my orders.
And what did that say?
It had Carole's name, her home address, her work address, both phone numbers, window of opportunity, which is the window that I had to complete my mission between March 28th through May 20th, and her prior training.
Norman said that the final thing that was in the envelope was a newspaper clipping about a bombing that had taken place recently in Northern Ireland. Norman said he took this to mean that Carole had somehow been involved in the incident, and that he believed that this is why the hit had been put out on her.
And you were around Carole, and she seemed like the type of person that was being explained to you?
Yeah, in conversation, she also talked about the assassination, and she has actively participated in those types of conversations. So it's safe to say, yes, she does have that side to her.
As you might imagine, this was all sounding a little, well, totally made up. The whole thing seemed completely ridiculous, like something pulled from the pages of a bad spy thriller novel or something. But Norman kept insisting it was true. He said he had originally gotten into this because of the allure of the money he was promised. He was a single dad working multiple places to make ends meet, and he needed the cash to take care of him and his young son. He said it wasn't a small amount either. He had been promised $25,000 for the hit on Carole and $10,000 for the last job he did. That last part certainly caught the attention of detectives. Prior to this, they had kind of been humoring Norman to see where this would go, but now they were like, what do you mean the last job you did? That's when things got truly insane. Norman said, yeah, Carole's murder was actually the second mission he had been a part of. The first one had taken place a few months ago. Norman stated that back in February, he had been part of a group of 3 people who were recruited by the company to carry out a hit in Gresham, Oregon. The hit was on a man named Dean Noyes, who they had been told was embezzling money from a company he worked for. Dean had messed with the wrong people, and now they wanted revenge. Norman said he and the 2 other guys drove up to Gresham with a small arsenal of weapons. Once they were there, they met with a woman named Lynn, who they were told was going to be their handler. Lynn provided them with a bunch of information as well as a key to Dean's home. Norman explained that despite this, things had gone sideways. At first, they tried to wait for Dean at a parking garage where they believed he would be, but he never turned up. As for the key, they tried that at Dean's house, but it didn't fit the lock. As a result, they were forced to abort the mission. After hearing all of this, detectives were kind of sitting there with their mouths open. Like, all of this still sounded absolutely crazy, but it was so specific that they couldn't just ignore it. That's when Norman dropped another bombshell on them. He said, "Look, if you don't believe me, talk to Dale and Todd. They're part of the company too, and they were the ones who went on this mission with me." Authorities decided to do exactly that, and they began by sitting down with Dale Gordon. To their amazement, he not only corroborated everything Norman had told them, he added even more details. Dale said that, like Norman, he had been sucked into working for the company by the promise of quick and easy cash. He said the whole story about Oregon was true. They had received their orders, they drove down there with weapons. Todd had even brought a homemade silencer. He also talked about that meeting with Lynn, their handler, who had given them further instructions. Unlike Norman, though, Dale said he was thoroughly freaked out by the whole experience. He said that afterwards, he didn't want anything to do with the company. He said that he was still incredibly worried, though, because he knew what they were capable of. When detectives asked Dale what he meant by this, he said that Todd had told him before the Oregon mission that the company wasn't something to take lightly. Once you were in, and there was no going back. They had operatives everywhere, and they were willing to take out anyone, as well as their families if they were seen as a potential problem. This set off alarm bells for investigators because it sounded incredibly similar to something Norman had mentioned in his interview. Detectives had asked Norman, why didn't you just try to back out of the hit when you learned that Carole was the target? Norman explained that Todd told him that once he opened the envelope, he had to complete the mission no matter what. If not, the company would kill him and his son.
You couldn't get out of doing it.
Yeah, I'm a dead man. It's like signing a contract with the devil.
It went further, though. Todd was actually there when Norman opened the envelope with his instructions ordering him to kill Carole. Norman said that even though Todd knew what was going to happen, he said there was nothing they could do. Norman had to obey the company or they would end up dead instead.
He became very upset, but you could tell it disturbed him. But yet he couldn't do anything about it because of the lifestyle.
At this point, investigators had their suspicions as to what was going on, but they could tell that there was still something they were missing. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, though, there was a hidden thread just below the surface of all of this. And once police figured out what it was, all of the pieces of the case would finally begin to link together. On May 22nd, 1998, so just under a week after Carole's murder, a funeral was held for her and her unborn son, Jesse. The service was incredibly emotional, and adding to the sense of crushing heartbreak was the fact that there wasn't any kind of closure. Sure, Norman Daniels had been arrested, and pretty much everyone knew by this point that he was the killer, but the whole thing still really didn't make any sense. What no one knew at the time, though, was that investigators were still very much hard at work, even in the midst of the service. They were amongst the crowd of grieving friends and family members, but they were there to do more than simply pay their respects. It would end up paying off in a pretty huge way. As they were observing that day, detectives noticed that there was a woman who was being pretty touchy-feely with Todd. She was getting very close to him, like close enough that you could tell they weren't just friends. It was enough that they decided they needed to figure out who she was. Authorities learned that the woman had actually gone to school with Todd. In fact, she was a former girlfriend of his and was a pretty big fan of his band back in the day. They also learned that her name was Lynn. Lynn, as in the person that Norman and Dale both claimed that they had met with as part of the botched assassination job. However, when police looked further into Lynn's background, she wasn't some crazy hitman handler giving orders for a shadowy international contract killing ring. She was a married mother of two who worked as a preschool teacher's aide in Gresham, Oregon. Oh, yeah, and the person she was married to? That was Dean Noyes, the man Norman and Dale claimed that they had been sent there to kill. As I mentioned before, after speaking with Norman and Dale, detectives already had their suspicions about what was going on. You know, all of this stuff about the company, it all seemed like it was coming from Todd. Todd was the one who introduced both of them to the idea. He was the one that had been there when they got their orders, and he had also come with them and done most of the planning during the failed murder attempt in Oregon. But the missing piece in all of this was why? Well, with this huge revelation, police had found it. Todd and Lynn were involved in a secret affair. When Lynn was brought in for questioning, she initially attempted to deny this. She said she had no idea what was going on, but that she was willing to help as much as she could.
I appreciate you coming down.
Oh, thank you.
We're just here to clear up discrepancies.
What?
And if there's things been left out, we want to get to the truth.
I'm trying to help tell as much as I can, do anything I can, because I want to avoid as much legal trouble as possible.
This continued when Lynn was asked about her relationship with Todd. She denied that anything was going on between them and stated that if anything, it was just Todd who was in love with her.
You know, he's always said, you know, I care about you. You know that I still love you, that I've been in love with you, blah, 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 blah.
You said it wasn't your plan to get rid of Dean so you two could be together. That wasn't your intent.
That was not my intent at all.
You say that without a damn bit of hesitation.
Yeah, you're right, I do. That's the best truth that I can give you.
However, Lynn's tune completely changed when detectives started to confront her with the evidence that they had been given by Norman and Dale. That's when Lynn admitted to basically everything. She still suggested that Todd was the main driver of what had happened, but she admitted that she was involved in both of the plans, the failed one targeting Dean and the successful one targeting Carole.
You were more involved in Carole's death as well as the plan to kill Dean than you led us to believe. It's time to get it all out in the open.
I guess I've been in love with Todd my whole entire life. For some reason I thought he and I could be happy together. And then at that point he suggested, well, if you want to be happy, get rid of Dean, we need to get rid of Carole somehow, some way, and live happily ever after. He said at one point that he wanted her to be gone before the baby was born. I could have prevented it. I didn't, because I didn't really care. He's always been a knight in shining armor, but also turn around and he's the devil himself, and I don't know why. I've been so drawn to that forever. Sounds like I'm hexed. I'm under spell when it comes to him. And he knows that. He's played on that for a long time.
The plan was kill Carole, kill Dean, and then you could be together.
Yeah.
If there were any remaining doubts about what had happened here, those went away when detectives seized all of the suspects' computers. As they dug through the hundreds of pages of emails and instant messages between them, the full chilling scope of the plot became incredibly clear. Todd and Lynn had worked together to manipulate Norman and Dale into believing this whole grand conspiracy about the company. There was no network of assassins, no secret handlers. Everyone who Norman and Dale had talked to was either Lynn or one of Todd's aliases. That's including all of the Colonel Sean messages, which were traced back to Todd's IP address. The vast majority of the communications, though, were between Todd and Lynn, and showed that they had been engaged in an affair for some time. As for why they had done all of this, part of it was so that they could be together, but even more than that, it was money. Todd and Lynn both had life insurance policies out on their spouses, and they stood to benefit financially from the crimes. The policy on Carole was for $125,000, and the one on Dean was fairly sizable as well. You might be thinking to yourself at this point, how could Norman and Dale have bought into such a ridiculous scheme? Like, did they honestly believe all of this stuff about the company? Well, based on everything we came across, it seems like the answer is, yeah, they did. Now, before you go ripping them in the comments section, it's worth pointing out just how manipulative Todd was. When you hear all of these details about the company laid out like this, it all sounds pretty stupid. But keep in mind, he had been slowly building them up with stories like this for years. Todd claimed to have been in a much higher rank in the Marines than he ever was, and apparently earned Norman and Dale's respect initially by showing them his medals, including a Purple Heart. None of the sources we came across mention whether these medals were actually real or not, but certainly a lot of the stories he told Norman and Dale were complete nonsense. He talked about being a sniper and going on covert operations for the CIA. Among these were trips he said he had taken to South America to assassinate high-level drug dealers for the DEA. As for the IRA stuff, Todd apparently stole most of what he knew from a real IRA member who he had met as a young man back in Portland. But essentially, all of this was kind of like the boiling frog metaphor. Todd turned up the crazy so low and slow that by the time Norman and Dale were introduced to the idea of the company, it kind of just made sense to them. Case in point, even after Norman's initial arrest, Todd still tried to keep the charade going. In a call between them that was recorded while Norman was in jail, he can still be heard suggesting that his contacts were going to take care of everything.
What's going on? Talk to me here. So you said you did?
Well, I mean, they had a search warrant, and they went in.
Yeah?
They got the pistol. It was only obvious.
Listen, I'm going to get on the phone with the big boys and see what we can pull here.
Okay.
It's also worth mentioning that Dale and Norman were not the only ones that were duped. As much as Lynn definitely helped to plan and orchestrate all of this, there's no question that Todd was the one in the driver's seat. Lynn had gone back and forth multiple times on whether she actually wanted to go ahead with the attempt on Dean's life. And in the end, part of the reason it failed is because she gave Todd bad information about where he would be and when. She would later claim that Todd was insistent that this was the only way forward, and that at one point when she wavered, he attacked her while they were in a hotel room together. Todd also lied to Lynn a bunch about his and Carol's relationship. He made Carole seem like a terrible person and told Lynn he didn't even think the baby was his. This was all part of the central lie at the heart of Todd's life, which was this image he painted of himself as this excited, expectant father and family man. The truth was, Todd never wanted children. He hated young kids and couldn't stand his life, which he felt was boring and ordinary. That's why he had concocted all of these bizarre and elaborate stories to make himself sound important, interesting, and accomplished. The irony of all of this, of course, was that when Todd was brought in and questioned about all of this, he had nothing to say. He refused to speak with detectives and almost immediately asked for a lawyer.
Here's Dale. We wanted to talk to you, give you a chance to clean some of this stuff up if it could be. As we speak, we're preparing a warrant for your arrest.
For what?
Murder and conspiracy. You have to know by now that both Lynn and Norman have rolled on you.
I'd really rather not hear any of this. You want to talk about what happened? Nope. You want to tell your side of the story? I'd rather have an attorney at this point. You have the right to remain silent?
Todd's lack of cooperation didn't matter, though, as by now the case against him was overwhelming. Police had confessions from Dale, Norman, and Lynn, as well as a variety of other pieces of evidence. This included a ring that Todd had, which he had used to press the wax seal on the envelope he gave to Norman. Police had also managed to recover the homemade silencer from the attempted murder on Dean Noyes, which Todd had apparently stupidly thrown over a fence at the crime scene. When Todd went to trial in early 2001, he denied everything and painted himself as a loving husband who cared deeply about his wife and unborn son. He claimed Lynn was obsessed with him and that Norman had killed Carole all on his own. Lynn, Norman, and Dale all testified against Todd, and boy, were they mad. By this point, all of them realized just how much they'd been lied to and manipulated by him. Norman and Dale were especially angry, and during their testimony, both had to be admonished by the judge. Norman, because he was so eager to testify that he kept going off on tangents every time he was asked something. Dale, meanwhile, flipped Todd off in open court. When asked why they had believed Todd's stories, Dale said he didn't think a fellow Marine would ever do something like this to him. Norman, meanwhile, basically just admitted he was a gullible guy, stating, quote, "It's a fault, I guess. I'm a trusting person. For example, if you told me you had $1 million in the bank, I wouldn't ask for your bank statement." In the end, Todd, Norman, and Lynn were convicted of a number of crimes related to Carole's murder and the killing of her unborn son, while Dale was convicted in connection with the attempted murder of Dean Noyes. Dale and Lynn received the lowest sentences because they took plea deals. They were sentenced to 10 years and 25 years to life, respectively. Norman, meanwhile, received 50 years to life, and Todd was sentenced to death. Dale was released from prison after serving 8 years and 7 months, while Lynn was paroled in 2019 and Norman was paroled in 2022. At the time of this recording, Todd Garton remains on death row at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, California. I don't know about you, but for me, this definitely feels like one of the darkest things I've come across in a while. Not only was this crime completely twisted and bizarre in its execution, it was also just so senseless. As you might imagine, the revelation that Todd had masterminded everything was a huge blow to Carole's family. Initially, they had stood by him and didn't believe for a second he could be capable of something this terrible. It's not hard to understand why they defended him at first, because Todd was lying to everyone. He put on this big performance as the grieving husband and even gave the eulogy at Carole's funeral. I don't know what you can call that other than evil. It seems that's certainly how Carole's family felt too. In an article we came across about dealing with tragedy and learning to forgive, Carole's stepmother summed it up this way. Quote, "I know it's not very Christian, but I don't know how you forgive someone who's not sorry." I completely agree, especially because they didn't just lose a daughter, they lost their grandchild as well. It's just absolutely crushing to think about. For Carole's dad, he said it was the small things that he missed the most. The calls they would have once a week, the love she showed for everyone around her, and the sound of her voice when she would say hi to him. I want to end with a few of his words. Quote, "I miss the joy. I miss not having her in my life. I think about her every day. She didn't have any enemies. It was such a senseless thing."
Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.